Hello, and thank you for dropping by. I hope that you've been navigating through this difficult time. I've been staying very busy with some projects that I know you'll like. And I want to tell you that I appreciate your interest in the stars and the myths, and that I'm hard at work, as always. I'm hard at work on ways to really focus on what this connection means for our lives, how this information can really help you wherever you are right now and whatever you're going through, because it is actually so practical and so applicable to whatever you're facing at this particular moment. But like everything else, you have to know how to apply it the right way. It's kind of like a martial art. You want it to actually work in real life. And we all know stories of people who thought they knew what they were doing and then found out that they really didn't know how to apply what they thought they knew in real life. I'm talking about martial arts, people who thought they knew what they were doing, and then when it came time to actually apply it in a situation that really mattered in their life, they found out they really didn't know how to apply it. So it's not really funny. It's actually a very serious matter. And the ancient wisdom in the myths can definitely be applied in real life. And I'm absolutely convinced that understanding the celestial language that the ancient myths around the world are all using helps us to understand that application to our real life. But just like in the world of martial arts, there are some people who might lead you down the wrong path in this regard. I received some feedback on a video, and I want to emphasize I'm talking about the teachers, not the students who follow those teachers mistakenly. It's the people who are spreading the bad martial arts that get other people into trouble that I'm talking to here. So not the person who brought me this question. So I received some feedback on a video about a month ago that relates to this topic. It's a very good question. So Neon Pop 80 wrote, "Hey Matheson, I've been following you for years. I see these correlations, but I'd argue these stories are made up to describe movements in the skies of images created to be an imaginary map. These knowledge was hidden from the common people because it gave some power over people in terms of convincing the people of their ability to predict the future and forecast weather. I used to feel there was a spirit aspect, but now I question it. What makes you see the spirit's story in this? Where is this connection you make?" First, thank you, Neon Pop 80, for this question. This is a good question. You may or may not be aware that this argument that you're kind of advancing in this question, this argument has been around for a long time. And it's an example of what I call shallow astrotheology, which is where an author or a teacher sees at least some of the evidence that the myths are based on the heavenly cycles, which the myths absolutely are, using the heavenly cycles as this esoteric metaphorical foundation for what they're talking about. So some author, some teacher sees at least some of the evidence that the myths are based on the heavenly cycles, but doesn't really go deep enough to make the application to our lives, and in a sense can end up doing more harm than good. These writers who write about the myths in the connection to the heavens, but in a shallow way, are kind of like the kung fu teacher who knows a little bit about kung fu and thinks they can go teach others, and it ends up potentially doing more harm than good, because if you think you know what you're doing because some teacher who you trusted taught you, but they didn't teach you the real thing, you can get into a lot more trouble. And so I don't blame Neon Pop 80 for asking this question. I don't want to be misconstrued when I start to answer this question as criticizing Neon Pop 80. Just like I don't blame the student of a bad kung fu teacher for what they learned from that teacher. It's the teacher that I'm talking to. This kind of shallow teaching about the ancient myths has been around for a long time. I'm going to show you an example here from 1882. by an author named Robert Hewitt Brown. The book, published in 1882 by this author, is called Stellar Theology and Masonic Astronomy. And so I'm going to start with some quotations from this book from 1882 by Robert Hewitt Brown, starting in chapter 2. Here the author starts out by saying, God is worshipped under the symbol of the sun. Okay, so right away we can see that the author is realizing a connection between the heavenly bodies and the ancient myths. And then Robert Hewitt Brown goes on to say that whoever was using the symbol of the sun to worship God started to confuse the symbol with what it symbolized. And then Robert Hewitt Brown goes on to say that so the gods are based on the sun, basically, he's going to argue, and the goddesses, he's going to say, are based on Virgo, playing the role of female goddesses in the myths, along with the moon, which is partly true, although actually all the constellations sometimes play male figures and sometimes female figures. In other words, Virgo definitely plays female figures in the myths. Virgo can also show up as a male figure, just like the constellation Hercules can actually show up often as a male figure, but can also show up as a female figure. The constellation Sagittarius plays female figures in a lot of myths, also male figures. So all the constellations can play different roles, both male and female roles in the myths. So it's not that Virgo is the only constellation associated with female figures in the myths. And then Robert Hewitt Brown makes a statement that these stories are, quote, absurd enough if understood as real histories, but the allegorical key being given, many of them are found to contain profound and sublime astronomical truths. Well, I wouldn't disagree with that statement. That's true enough as far as it goes. But unfortunately, Robert Hewitt Brown thinks that if you have the key, the allegorical key being given, they unlock sublime astronomical truths. And the motion of the heavens are sublime. The motions of the planets, the changing of the seasons, the various celestial phenomena such as eclipses, and all these beautiful cycles of the celestial mechanics, as they're sometimes called. It is sublime. But he argues that basically that's what these myths are all about. And so those who knew these things about the natural world and they hid them in the myths, he believes that they could then use that knowledge. That was the main knowledge that they were allegorizing. They could use that knowledge to impress and to awe everybody else. And so he says, quote, by these means, the priests of Egypt ruled the people with a despotic power. The fables of the mythology disclosed to them grand scientific truths, and to them only. The very stories themselves served to perpetuate those truths for the benefit of the initiated, and also formed an easy vehicle for their transmission. End quote. So according to this reading, that's what the myths are. That's all they really are. A complicated way of teaching scientific truths and then easily transmitting them within stories to those who are the initiated. And by knowing these scientific truths, Robert Hewitt Brown says, the priests of Egypt were able to rule the people with a despotic power. So keeping them hidden in myth was important. Why? For oppressing the people. If the secret gets out, then the game is over, kind of like in The Wizard of Oz with the man behind the curtain. So Robert Hewitt Brown then goes on to say, the people worship the sun, moon, and stars as gods, and in knowledge of their true nature would have at once put an end to the influence of the priests. The priest of a pretended god, when once his god is exposed, stands before the world a convicted impostor. End quote. So here he's arguing that all the gods described in the myths are not real. It's just a bunch of scientific knowledge dressed up in stories. He's wrong about that. But let's continue. He says, of course, a knowledge of astronomy diffused among the people would have been fatal to these pretensions. Well, according to this theory, Robert Hewitt Brown's argument, then the myths don't really have a purpose anymore, because today everyone can learn about astronomy. It's not a secret anymore. They can look up online and find out when the moon is going to be full and when it's going to be a new moon. They can find out the date and time of the next eclipse years into the future. You can look that up absolutely free on the web. No charge, no subscription, no oppression or exploitation involved. So obviously the study of astrotheology is pretty much no longer important, because this was all in order to just hide science from the people. And if the truth got out and we found out that it's just the moon and it's just the sun, then all those pretended gods and their pretended priests won't have any more power. And now we teach science to everyone, in 8th grade. So not only is it taught for free, we make you take it. You can't get away from it. You can't decide not to take science class. So conspiracy theorists can just relax and move on to something else, because obviously this is an old story from before anybody knew what the moon and the sun were and the stars. And obviously no one has to worry about this problem that Robert Hewitt Brown is describing anymore, right? And then final point from Robert Hewitt Brown's book, and this is another very common argument, and this is the last one I'll show from his book. He argues that virtually all the female goddesses are either the moon or the constellation Virgo, and then he argues that virtually all the gods relate to the sun. He says, quote, "The names under which the sun was personified were many, but one great feature, most prolific of fables, was his great decline in light and heat during the winter, and his renewal in glory and power at the vernal equinox and summer solstice, which gave rise to all that class of legends which represent the sun god under various names as dying and being restored to life again." End quote. Well, that's a very common argument. It's all about the cycle of spring, summer, winter, and fall. And the ancients needed these myths, and they needed their priests to tell them, as if in ancient times we needed myths and complicated allegories to tell us what's probably the most obvious cycle in the world. I mean, when it starts to turn to spring, it's obvious to everyone. We don't need coded myths and stories about Osiris to tell you that. And if you're a farmer or if you have a garden, whether it's in ancient times or modern times, I would argue you don't need anyone to tell you when to plant and when not to plant. If you plant you do it a few times, and a frost and ice kills off all your plants, and you figure out when you're supposed to do it. You don't need myths to tell you that. That's shallow astrotheology. These teachers who are putting this information out there are recognizing something that is true, that the ancient myths are based on the sun, moon, planets, and stars and heavenly cycles, but they don't know how to apply it. Now, in defense of Robert Hewitt Brown, first of all, he wrote this book in 1882. That was a long time ago. Times were different then. For one thing, recognizing a connection between the stories in the Bible and the heavenly phenomena was probably a lot more radical to write about in 1882. And we should appreciate the work of everyone who's honestly and sincerely trying to find the truth and to help others. But there are a lot of ways that this kind of shallow astrotheology leads people astray, in my opinion. First, the analysis is very shallow because it's primarily based on the sun and the moon, with very limited understanding of the role played by the constellations. But at least it does realize that the stories are metaphorical in nature, which is very important. Second, it thinks that the purpose of the myths is for hiding astronomical knowledge and keeping that knowledge from the majority of men and women. In other words, it's a primarily negative function. It's a negative function to keep it away from you, or from the majority. Third, even more negative, it's argued that the reason to keep this astronomical knowledge from the people was to use that knowledge to trick the people into thinking that you have special powers, so you can then oppress them and enrich yourself. Finally, you might have noticed that Robert Hewitt Brown argues that this system began in Egypt and then spread to the rest of the world from there. Now, there's a lot of problems with this shallow astrotheology. First of all, it fails to grasp the fact that the constellations play an absolutely central role in the system. The focus on the sun and the moon to the exclusion of the constellations means you're not going to understand more than half of what the ancient myths are trying to convey, according to my experience and analysis thus far. The constellations are by far the majority of the connections in the ancient myths. The sun, moon, and planets definitely play a role, but the constellations are major language. So if you're missing that, you're missing a lot of the meaning, the majority. And that leads to all these other problems. So second, this author makes the argument that these myths are just there to encode astronomical cycles. And this is basically the same thing that Neon Pop 80 was asking about, probably because these arguments from 1882 are still being taught by those who claim to be teaching you about astrotheology. But the thing that they're missing is that the heavenly cycles are in and of themselves a metaphor. The constellations and the planets are pointing us towards something else. They're pointing us towards an invisible realm. They're pointing us towards the realm of the gods. But the constellations of the planets are not the gods themselves. They're teaching us something about a reality we cannot see. And what they're teaching us can absolutely be shown to have a positive and an uplifting and an empowering message for our lives, which brings me to point 3, which is one of the biggest problems with shallow astrotheology, and that is it's primarily negative. It says, oh, those myths, they're just about astronomy, and it was just for keeping the people oppressed. They're just tools used by liars and con artists to trick people like Oz in The Wizard of Oz. And that's essentially what Robert Hewitt Brown is arguing in these passages that we looked at. And if you're able to see that the myths are a metaphor, but then you're not able to see what they're really about, you're able to see enough to know that they're not what we've been told that they are by people who are saying to take them literally, that they're literal stories about things that happened in the ancient past. The story of Samson, or the story of Moses in the Red Sea. They're celestial metaphor. Those aren't literal figures that actually lived in human history. Samson and Moses and all these other figures in the myths. So if you don't understand the real purpose of the metaphors, then you naturally think that seeing through the metaphor diminishes them. Oh, okay, I see. They're not really. They're just about something less than what you thought they were about. Oh, it's just about what I learned in 8th grade science class. But actually, they're so much more than mere history. They're teaching us absolutely profound and uplifting things which we need in our lives. If Samson was really just a strong guy who lived 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, so what? How does that help you in your life today? If you're not the world's strongest man, it does not directly apply to your life. But if you understand what the story is really about, it absolutely can help you right where you are today, this very moment. And it's a very positive and empowering and uplifting message. But shallow astrotheology is basically negative. It diminishes the myths and says they're just a way of encoding science info, which was then used to trick the people and oppress you. It's a giant con game. It's like knowing enough kung fu to get you into trouble. It doesn't help you, though. It just makes you bitter and cynical. Shallow astrotheology shows you enough to see that the myths are based on the heavens, but not enough to know what it really is talking about, what the heavens are supposed to be teaching you. And so it's primarily negative, and it's harmful and misleading. If you don't know enough kung fu to help someone, you should stop teaching it, or you're going to get your students into trouble. And like I said, this was 1882. There's been some developments since then. It's like, the way they were teaching boxing in 1882, we can't really make fun of how they were teaching boxing in 1882 and say, well, look at how Mike Tyson fights. We've had developments since then. So point number, the last one here that I put up, it predates even ancient Egypt. This system was already in place in the very earliest texts of Egypt, as well as in the earliest surviving texts of Sumer, ancient Mesopotamia, and it's found around the world in other extremely ancient cultures, including the cultures of ancient India, ancient China, as well as the ancient civilizations of the Americas, such as the Olmec and the Maya and the Inca and whoever else was in the Americas, and whoever carved the massive stones at Tiwanaku. We can see it in the traditions of all the nations of the First Nations of North America, the indigenous Native Americans of North America as well. This system is very ancient. It predates ancient Egypt. It predates ancient India. It predates ancient China. By this question, I'm guessing you probably encountered some teachers of what I call shallow astrotheology somewhere, and I don't blame you for that. The above commentary is criticizing the teachers of bad kung fu, not the students who are trying to learn and who sometimes encounter unhelpful teaching. That's not the student's fault. But you do want to be very careful about who you choose to learn from when it comes to martial arts, and the same applies in other areas too. So the question Neon Pop 80 asks is, I used to feel there was a spirit aspect, but now I question it. What makes you see the spirit story in this? Where is this connection you make? Well, I'll give a very brief answer here, but first I'm guessing that perhaps you have not been to my website, starmythworld.com, where I have a section called Blog, which has over 1,200 entries, over 1,200 entries, going back many years, which you can search through. It's fully searchable. You can also find it in a Blogger version, which has a Google search engine tied to it. So you can search through everything I've ever written for keywords and find things I've written to help answer that question. But also there's a section called Books, where I've listed my books, which you can buy, and they have literally thousands of pages. And even at thousands of pages, I've only just barely scratched the surface of what could be explored about the connection between the myths and the stars and the application to what we might call the spirit aspect and the application to real life, our life today. And of course, there's also videos and podcast interviews you can check out, which you can also find at the website. So if these ancient myths and their connections to the stars are not just about hiding grand scientific truths, as Robert Hewitt Brown says, what are they about? If they're not just about a bunch of stories to tell us about the changing of the seasons from winter to spring to summer to fall, what are they for? They absolutely do use the cycles of the heavens and the cycle of the solstices and equinoxes, but it's very shallow to think that they stop there. That's not what they're about. They're not telling you about an equinox. They used these cycles, the equinoxes and the solstices, to convey their message. And one of the most central messages that they're conveying has to do with your reconnection to your essential self, your reconnection to yourself. That's one of the most important, if not the most important message in the world. It's so important, messages in the world. It's so important, and yet the ancient myths actually tell us, both in metaphor and at times coming out and saying it directly, that most people do not even realize that they are disconnected from their own self. The ancient myths teach us about that disconnection and how to repair it, how to recover who we are. Dr. Gabor Mate, in an interview published in 2019 on Human Window, an interview conducted by Martin Caparota, explains this disconnection from the self and how it can happen without our even knowing it. He says, when I talk, this is a quotation from Dr. Gabor Mate, he says, when I talk about connection to oneself, I'm talking about something very simple. It's an organism's capacity to know what it feels and to be able to respond with emotions that are appropriate to the present moment. Without that capacity, you can't survive. If an animal does not have a connection to itself and doesn't know what it feels, it can't respond to threats. It's going to be dead. The same with human beings in evolution. When I talk about being connected to ourselves, I'm talking about actually knowing what we feel and experience in a given moment and being able to interpret that appropriately. Without that capacity, we're lost. We're born with that capacity. You've never met an infant who's not connected with its gut feelings. By the time you talk to adults, you find many people who, even if they have their gut feelings, they ignore them. Something happens between infancy and adulthood that disconnects us. What that is our need for acceptance by our environment. If our environment cannot support our gut feelings and emotions, then the child, in order to belong and fit in will automatically, unwittingly, and unconsciously suppress their emotions and their connections to themselves for the sake of staying connected to the nurturing environment, without which the child cannot survive. Furthermore, if the parents themselves are not in touch with their feelings, they can't tolerate the child's feelings because they threaten them. The parent reacts against the child for having anger, and the child learns, I mustn't express what I feel because I have to belong to my parents. If I don't, who will protect me and nurture me? Automatically, we disconnect from ourselves in order to continue to be looked after. It's a tragic choice. It's not even a choice. The child's not aware of making a choice. It's an automatic process. Then we get into adulthood, and all of a sudden we say, I don't know who I am. End quote. That's how we can suppress our essential and authentic self without even knowing it. And if you're familiar with the work of Dr. Gabor Mate, one of the most respected voices in the field of psychological trauma and recovery from it, then you know that he finds abundant evidence that this disconnection from the self is the root cause of almost all depression, chronic anxiety, all the many forms of addiction, and even of chronic illness. Because when we're anxious all the time, our body actually produces physical responses, physical hormones, responses that are intended to be helpful in an emergency situation, but which cause huge health problems if they're running all the time, if that switch is always on. Now, I'm also not suggesting that Dr. Gabor Mate agrees with the things that I write about or talk about, but the ancient myths can be shown to be teaching us about this tragic problem and to point us towards the path to recovering our connection with ourself, to recovering our essence, our authentic self that we got disconnected from. For one thing, we see this in the myths. One of the most common patterns in the myths around the world is the pattern of twins. You see this pattern in the Gilgamesh epic with Gilgamesh and Enkidu. You see this pattern in the Greek myths with the story of Castor and Polydeuces, or Castor and Pollux as the Romans called them, those twins. You actually see it in the story of Heracles, or Hercules is the Roman name for Heracles, who has a twin brother named Iphicles. Heracles and Iphicles are actually twins. You see it in the hero twins of Central America in the sacred traditions of the Maya, and you see it over and over again in the Bible, including in the story of Jacob and Esau, and also in the figure of Thomas, who's known as Doubting Thomas, and who in the Gospel, according to John, is called Thomas Didymus, which means Thomas the twin. So what's with all these twins in the ancient myths? I'll tell you, they're not actually two different people. These stories are about your disconnection from your essential self, from your authentic self. I only gave male examples. There's also female examples. Eros and Psyche is often a divine figure and a mortal figure. We see that in Gilgamesh and Enkidu. We see that in Castor and Pollux. We see that in Eros and Psyche. They're not actually two different people. These stories are about you and your disconnection from your essential self, from your authentic self, a disconnection that in most cases happens without your even being consciously aware of it. You can read more about this subject in my blog posts and in my books, and the blog posts are all free, of course. And so to finish this video off, to answer the question of what about the spirit, I'm convinced that when we begin to recover that connection to our essential self, we begin to hear what our authentic self has to tell us, and it's a lot. And you've probably already experienced it from time to time. When you get a premonition, or an inspiration, or a synchronicity, or a message in a dream, and you say, wow, where did that come from? And strangely enough, sometimes you can get those kinds of messages or premonitions or inspirations or connections from people who are very, very far away from you at the time, maybe in another state, another country, even another continent. And it's really not possible to explain that using the conventional materialist paradigm, because the essential self, or what the ancients sometimes called the higher self, is actually how we're in touch with the invisible realm, the realm of the gods. The ancient myths are talking about very powerful, very beneficial truths, very powerful and very beneficial realities that apply directly in our lives in so many ways. Does that mean that they have not ever been used to deceive and to oppress and to enrich one group at the expense of another group? Of course not. They've absolutely been used to do all kinds of things like that. All kinds of the things that Robert Hewitt Brown was talking about, including deceiving and oppressing others. And there's still use for that today. Just like a martial art, this power can be used to beat people up, to bully people, to harm them very badly. But it can also be used to protect others, to help others, and to empower others, and to empower ourselves for beneficial purposes, to enable us to live up to our full potential, to not sabotage ourselves, which I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of sabotaging yourself. Uh, that implies almost a division, sabotaging yourself, working against yourself. It can be used to enable us to not sabotage ourselves, to enhance what, what we're really intended to do, also to enhance justice and to oppose oppression and exploitation. And I can show you evidence from the myths themselves that this is their intended purpose for justice in opposition to exploitation. But they have been twisted to be used for oppression and for exploitation. So if you'd like to know more about this subject, which is to me just about the most important subject in the world, please check out some of the material available at my website, and I'll be working on more resources in the near future to help you apply this tremendous inheritance given to humanity in the myths of the world to your life in a positive way. Sending my best wishes to each of you for wholeness and connection with who you really are. Thanks for watching.